One of the main complaints that people have had against Formula 1 recently, apart from the obvious, is the tracks on which they race. It sounds stupid given that Formula 1 is supposed to be racing at the best tracks in the world, but in reality they don't, and a lot of the time they choose to race for the highest bidder. Which is fair enough, I guess. F1 is primarily a business, so making money has to be at the forefront of this. But the consequences of this approach are that we've lost some great tracks from the calendar over the years. So I've put together a list of what are, in my opinion, the 9 tracks that we'll probably never race at again. Sort of like a top 10, but with 9. So without any more waffling, the first track on my list is Mugello. This is the most recently raced on track on this list, but I still think it deserves a place. We saw its only ever appearance on the calendar in 2020, and probably most notably in the Grand Prix was the massive pileup that happened on the safety car restart. It should go without saying that this pileup was not at all the fault of the track, and when we eventually got racing, it was quite a good race. Turn 1 made for some great opportunities to pass around the outside, and the fast nature of the circuit meant it really showcased the speed of a Formula 1 car. It's not the most impressive track on the calendar by any stretch, but it sure was cool to watch and just take in the speed of Formula 1. Seeing as it was only ever used as a replacement for the gappy 2020 calendar, I think it's unlikely we'll ever see it raced on again, but hey, I might be wrong. Next on the list is actually 2 tracks, the Nurburgring. I say this because Formula 1 has raced on both the Nordschleifer and the GP layouts, and they're both good enough to warrant a place on this list. Starting off with the Nordschleifer, it was used for Grand Prix racing from 1929 to 1976. Obviously, with the Formula 1 Championship not existing until 1950, not all of these would have been Formula 1 races, but even so it counts in my opinion. It was dropped for 55 after the death of a driver during practice, however it returned in 1956 for another 3 years, before it claimed the life of Peter Collins. It then rejoined the calendar for 1961, where it stayed until 1970. Then, after some work done including the Armco barriers and straightening some corners, it came back for 1971 to 1976. The 1976 Grand Prix was proposed by Niki Lauda to be boycotted by the drivers, but after the other drivers rejected his proposal, it went ahead, and this was the race in which Lauda crashed and suffered severe burns. I think it goes without saying that the Nordschleifer is not ever going to be used again for modern F1 because, for one, the speeds of modern F1 are so high that any mistake would result in a huge accident. But as well as this, it's such a long circuit that keeping it marshalled, filmed and within radio range would be next to impossible. Plus, with it being around a 4-minute lap, it wouldn't exactly be great to watch as a spectator. Most importantly though, it continued to claim the lives of those who raced on it, and that's not a good look for F1. That said, I still think the Nordschleifer counts as one of the best tracks F1's ever raced on, simply for the spectacle. It's easily the track where drivers' skill and bravery can make the most difference, and there's a reason that car makers still return to it as a way to prove how good their cars are. And now, the GP circuit. This was used from 1984 to 85, and then again between 1995 and 2006, under the name European Grand Prix. It then went on to alternate hosting the German Grand Prix with the Hockenheimring, before being taken off the calendar before 2015. Like Mugello, it had a 1-race stint in 2020, but it's unlikely we'll see it again. Rest in peace, Nürburgrings, you will be missed. Another 2021 is next, which is the Bahrain short layout. Now, technically we still race on most of the track, but we've only ever used this layout once, in 2020. It was the track where we saw George Russell's Mercedes performance and Sergio Perez's first win, along with some great moves. In terms of racing, the standard track for Bahrain is so much better, but as a variation, the short layout was pretty cool. The US Grand Prix at Indianapolis is one that didn't have a long stint, but it was still a good one while it lasted. Formula 1 raced on the Grand Prix layout of the Indianapolis Motor Speedway from 2000 to 2007, sort of. It's definitely had its fair share of exciting moments, such as in 2002 when Michael Schumacher tried to orchestrate a tie finish, but slowed down too much and gave his teammate the win. Even with this small inconvenience though, Michael won 5 of the 7 races between 2000 and 2006, which is pretty good going. Most memorably though, is the 2005 Grand Prix, where only 6 cars started the race due to tyre issues. That's not a good thing, obviously. In terms of racing, it offered loads of passing opportunities, including a banked flat-out section which provided slipstreams and a big dive bomb opportunity into turn 1. It was taken off the calendar after Formula 1 and the Grand Prix organisers couldn't come to an agreement for 2008, and it hasn't had an F1 race since. It still hosts IndyCar though, and given that the series is named after the speedway, I don't think that's going to change anytime soon. The next one on the list is mainly here to please perspective, but nonetheless, it's still a great track. Obviously, I'm talking about Adelaide here, which is the only track on this list that hasn't been raced on in my lifetime. As a result, I don't have any memories about it, but from what I've seen it looks a good track, and it's definitely had some good races on it. It's also had some good crashes, but Michael Schumacher doing his best Rocket League trick is not a unique feature of a track. It was used for 11 races from 1985 to 1995, and like the current Australian Grand Prix track, it's a street circuit, but it feels way more like a street circuit than the Melbourne track does. It's got lots of tight, slow corners and close walls, and just generally looked like it was a good combination of driver skill and close racing. A solid 7.5 out of 10 track. Well done, Australia. Sepang is a track that I think a lot of us miss, and even though I think it's the worst track to drive on F1 2017 ever, I still think it deserves a place on this list. It was raced on from 1999 to 2017, with low ticket prices forcing it off the calendar. I think its most famous moment would be Lewis Hamilton's engine losing touch with reality in 2016, but just as Michael Schumacher's gymnastics weren't a unique feature of the track, Mercedes' car turning into a 200-mile-an-hour bomb isn't one of Malaysia's. I also think that Sepang is one of the best looking tracks that F1's ever raced on, and I don't exactly know why. It just is, you know? Anyway, I'm waffling as per. Valencia is a track that I don't think many people miss for the racing, but I miss it for the vibes. Daniel Ricciardo moment. It played host to Pastor Maldonado's one and only F1 win, which is probably the only notable moment in its 5 Grand Prix, so maybe this wasn't such a good choice to put on the list. Oh, but it was the race where Mark Webber's Red Bull gave him wings. That is quite probably the least funny joke I've ever said in my life. I won't be offended if you unsubscribe after that. Sorry. But no, I think it was an alright track. Not great, but not awful, and certainly better than some of the other tracks we don't race on anymore. 5 out of 10. Last but not least on this list is the Bud International Circuit. I've seen so much stuff about this track from the degenerates on Twitter, and for once I have to agree with what they're saying. It was only in F1 for 3 races from 2011 to 2015, all of which were won by Sebastian Vettel, and then it was taken off the calendar after a tax dodge. Basically, it was Vijay Mallya if he was made of tarmac. Even though it was dominated by only one team and driver, I still think it made for some solid racing, and just like in Valencia, it had a pretty cool vibe. Like Malaysia, it was a really good looking track in pictures. In 2022, it'll be hosting some FIA motorsport for the first time since F1 left, with the F4 Indian Championship. So I guess that could mean we might see an F1 race back in Bud at some point in the future? I don't know, I'm still trusting my gut that we won't race here again. Sad times, but still a solid 7 out of 10 track. Honourable mention to Kyalami, once again a very photogenic track and one that looks good for racing, but it's not included on my list because I can see it rejoining the calendar at some point in the near future. At least if all of Josh Revel's fanbase have a say. Anyway, I've been dragging a simple list out for plenty long enough now, so let me wrap this one up. Formula 1 has raced on a lot of circuits over the years, and while some of them have been pretty rubbish, there have been some really good ones too. I want to be proved wrong with all the tracks on my list, as I think we could do with having them back on the calendar. That said, adding the Nurburgring to the season would almost definitely result in a big crash, so maybe not that one. Anyways, thank you for listening to my waffle again. This video probably wasn't my best, but hey, you made it to the end and I might see you next week. If I can be bothered.
Only thing showing this late be the freak show. Call for your cum, I be checking through the peephole. Everything closed this late but your contacts. Catch a little contact.